Hey guys, Chad Hoover, welcome to today's video. Listen, in my last video, I told you about selecting a bass fishing rod and we discussed length, power, and action. So if you want to watch that video, head down to the description box and find the link there. Today, we're going to talk about why you should fish a spinning rod or a casting rod versus a spinning rod. All right guys, so before we jump into today's discussion about casting rods or spinning rods or why casting rod or why spinning rod, I got to give a big shout out to the folks at Fish USA for helping bring this video to you. As always, Fish USA is America's tackle box, your #1 place for all things fishing. So head over there to gear up, click on the link in the description box to be sure to go head over to all their socials so you can stay up to speed with all they have going on. All right, so let's jump into it. Casting rod versus spinning rod. You probably see a lot of people fish the same lures and the same presentations on both a spinning rod and a casting rod. And I guess that's perfectly fine, but I want to tell you today why I fish a casting rod and why I fish a spinning rod. So like always, I want to jump into some easy to understand, easy to remember stuff for you folks that don't hang around to the end of the videos. Now, I will tell you, we're gonna start doing some giveaways, some subscriber secret links and things along those lines. So you're gonna wanna hang out for the whole video, but I'm still gonna give you the juice up front. Just remember this, casting is for presentations where you stay in contact with the lure, and spinning is for presentations where you have slack in your line. So just remember, casting, contact, spinning, slack. That's a really good rule of thumb. Now let's jump into what exactly that means. So I'm gonna put this spinning rod down for just a second, and we're gonna talk about casting rods. Okay, so when it comes to casting rods, there's a couple of advantages to fishing a casting rod. For one, if you like to do a little quick snap cast, and you're not one of those guys that has to change hands, you've got your trigger between your fingers back here. You simply press the button, you snap off a cast. They're super accurate, they are really easy to fish, and there's not a lot to it. You really just cast and reel. And you're gonna hear me say this, casting, contact, spinning, slack, but that doesn't mean that there's not times that I let a lure fall on a slack line on a casting rod. It's just that that's a general rule of thumb. But here's what I really love about casting rods. Any presentation where I have to maintain constant contact with the lure, a direct cast and retrieve, a situation where I'm working the lure nonstop, like a topwater presentation where I'm doing a quick jerk reel, jerk reel, jerk reel. Actually, let me just throw it out there. If I'm throwing a topwater presentation, I want to do the quick just retrieve like that. That's a lot easier for me fishing a casting rod. Now, are there people out there that fish topwaters on spinning rods all day long, twice on Sunday? It's just not as easy for me, and it's something that I think you have a lot better success when fishing on a casting rod. So again, constant contact, steady retrieve, you want a casting rod. Something where you need a lot of leverage. If you're throwing a jig, if you're throwing something into cover, if you're punching, if you're flipping, you're gonna want a casting rod. So when it comes down to it, I by and large have about 90% casting rods and about 10% spinning. And I'll get into why, where, when I use spinning rods and then in just a minute. But again, constant contact, if I want leverage, if I want a steady retrieve, or if I want improved feel. And here's what I mean by that. With a casting rod, especially with the blank through grips, I'm gonna have my finger on that blank through. I'm also able to put the rod butt behind my forearm, and I'm able to put the tip of my rod, my finger on the shaft of the rod, which really increases sensitivity. So I can feel the bottom, I can drag it along, I can detect the most subtle bite. Between that and watching line, you pretty much can't have a fish do anything to my lure without me knowing about it. Another technique that I like to do with a casting rod is I really like to put my finger on the line like that so I can feel. I can go to a slack line, but if that fish picks it up, I can feel it right there. And that's a lot more difficult to do with a spinning rod just because of the configuration. One other technique that I do quite a bit with a casting rod is I fish what I call the flick technique or the finger roll. So I'll be paddling with one hand or I'll be holding myself in position, and then I will simply reach over and spin the reel with my finger on the back side, just like that. So I'm hop, 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 taking up my slack, hop, 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 taking up my slack, hop, 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 taking up my slack. And so that's one of my favorite techniques. What it allows me to do is maintain boat position, run my motor, change hands, do whatever I've got to do. And if a fish ever hits it, I'll show you. you can still set the hook. Even if the fish hits it hard and you happen to be caught one-handed, you can simply flick, point, and stick. I call it the flick and stick. And so I really love the ability to fish a casting rod. I feel like I have more direct contact. I think the rod is almost an extension of my arm. It gives me more feel, it gives me more control. And then when I set the hook, because of the way the rod's set up and because of the grip that I got, I feel like I have more leverage. Now, let's talk about spinning rods, why, where, when, and how you should use them. So remember, constant contact, casting, contact, casting. It's phonetic. I'm trying to give you some things to remember, make it easy. So then I said spinning slack. One of my favorite techniques this time of year, right now we're transitioning from fall into winter. The winter drawdown is happening on a lot of reservoirs. As that drawdown is happening, the water is pulling away from the banks and the crawfish are receding. So anytime you hear that little click, we don't have water temperatures below 55 yet right now, so the crawfish haven't gone into the ground in Tennessee. We've already had one small freeze, but the water temperature is still up in the high 50s. I think when we have sustained overnight lows, which by the way, we'll get into this more, when we have those really sustained overnight lows below freezing, then we'll get that water temperature down there. But right now, I'm still getting away with catching a lot of fish on finesse crawfish techniques. So for me, this is one of the #1 techniques that I use a spinning rod for. So if you remember in the beginning, I said casting contact, spinning slack. So what I mean by that is, with a spinning rod, I'm gonna grab the line with my finger, I'm gonna reach out and I'm gonna make a cast. Once I make that cast, I'm gonna pull a rod's length worth of line out, and then I'm gonna flip my bail. Now I have slack in my line. It really is that simple. For the most part, I'm gonna choose a spinning rod in scenarios where I want to fish my lure on a slack line. I'm gonna drag, 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 stop, drag, 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 stop. Now, one thing that I'll point out, a big mistake that I see anglers making in a lot of presentations with a spinning rod is they're moving their lure with their reel. Again, constant contact, constant retrieve, casting rod, slack line, slow retrieve, slack line, slow retrieve, slack, slow, spinning. Just remember that. I don't like to move the lure with the reel. I think a lot of times what happens is the fish hits it and feels me before I feel them. So what I like to do is drag the lure, let it stop, and then go slack on my line a little bit. Then I like to watch the line. When I see that line start to move off, or if I see it jump, I can point my rod, reel down, take up the slack, and set the hook all simultaneously. But notice, I didn't start to take up slack with my spinning reel until after I knew the fish was there. So I'm gonna move the lure with the rod, not the reel. I'm gonna take up my slack with the reel, spinning rod, slack. See what I'm doing here? Slow, spinning, slack, slow. Again, it's a real simple rule of thumb for me. Casting, constant. Casting, leverage, right? Spinning, slack. I like to fish slack techniques. So drop shot and things like that. Again, here's one other advantage, one of the major advantages for me in fishing a spinning rod. I hear people all the time say one of the main things they use spinning rods for is casting lighter lures. I can cast a really light lure on a casting rod. I just think that if you can't cast a light lure on a casting rod, it's probably because you have too fast of an action, too long of a rod, or you don't have your drag set correctly. So if you have the right length, the right power, and the right action, you can cast the lightest lure with a casting rod. So I dispel that. I don't really use that as a criteria. But if I'm fishing a slow presentation on a slack line, I like a spinning rod. Slow, slack, spinning. Here's what I mean by that. Again, cast it out. When it hits, I like to leave the bail open and pull off or rip off a rod's length worth of line. And then I like to watch the line until the lure hits the bottom. Then I'll flip my bail and I'll start to take up slack. One thing you do want to keep in mind when fishing a spinning rod, and I'll go much more in depth in this on how to avoid tangles, how to get out backlashes, how to avoid wind knots, but you always want to get the line on the water before you start to reel up your slack. I see people all the time with a big swoop in their line, or they make this arc cast and the lure hits the water and there's a whole bunch of slack and they reel it up and they get this twisted line into their spool. That causes all kinds of problems. It causes all kinds of kinks, and it really makes a nasty mess on a spinning rod. Again, I'm gonna stop now because I could talk about that for hours. I will do a video about how to maintain and avoid spinning rod, wind knots and tangles and things like that. It starts from the time you put the line on all the way to the end. Again, I'll talk about that later. Again, slack, slow, spinning. I don't like to say because it's a light lure or because I'm casting into the wind that I'm gonna use a spinning rod. I can cast into the wind. I think it's more about loading the rod correctly and casting at a low angle and not getting your line up in the air to where you get a lot of wind resistance. So I don't use that philosophy. It's more about the presentation than it is the cast. I like that drag, 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 stop, drag, drag, drag. And notice, I'm not taking up slack until I'm ready to lower my line, and I'm taking up my slack, but I'm lowering that rod tip. That line's laying on the water. That's keeping friction on that line, and I'm taking up my slack. That's going to keep me in contact with the lure. That's going to avoid that big swoop in the line, which is going to mean a fish could hit it and I won't even feel it because there's a big swoop. And it's going to keep me from getting wind knots and getting my spinning rod, my spinning reel tangled up. Real simple, guys. For me, it's a factor of contact, casting, constant retrieve, casting, slow retrieve, out of contact, slack line, spinning. It's not 100% rule of thumb because I do fish some stuff on a slack line like a Cinco with a casting rod. I do fish a Cinco every now and then on a spinning rod, especially if I'm fishing with somebody that can't quite cast and I want to show them the technique. But by and large, my rule of thumb is constant contact, I'm fishing a casting rod. Leverage, I'm fishing a casting rod. Finesse, slack line, slower presentations, I'm fishing a spinning rod. I'm moving the lure with my rod, taking up the slack with my reel. It's real simple. That's the breakdown. Do me a favor, if you like these type of videos, if this information is useful for you, leave a comment in the comment section. It takes a little bit of time on your part, means a whole lot to me, helps grow the channel, engages our analytics, and it really helps us be able to put out more content. Again, this video was brought to you guys by Fish USA. We couldn't do it without the awesome support of our sponsors. So click on the link in the description box, sign up for their newsletter, go check out their website and see what specials they have going on. They've got one of the biggest selections in the fishing industry. I'm proud to be associated with them because, again, they keep me outfitted, they keep me out on the water, and you can also pick up these all-pro rods and lose reels and everything else that I've been using here. Guys, we're gonna get into some specific techniques. If you wanna learn more about length, power, action, go watch my last video. We'll link that up in one of these little videos floating around my head here. That's really what it boils down to, is spinning, slack, slow, casting, constant, contact. Yeah, that's it. It's pretty straightforward. So, hope you liked it. Smash that thumbs up, leave a comment, and if you're new to the channel or if you just have thought about it and you haven't subscribed yet, just go ahead and subscribe. I mean, seriously, you get to see a lot more of this right here. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's video. Hope you're enjoying this video series. Stay tuned for my next video where I delve into are expensive rods and expensive reels worth the money.